Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have my series discussion for the Star Wars 9-book series, The Fate of the Jedi. This is a 9-book series that was published from, I believe, like 2010 to 2012, somewhere around there. Maybe the first book was 2009. 2009 was when the first book came out, but it was from 2009 to about 2012. It is 9 books by 3 different authors, each one taking, if you view it as 3 trilogies, Aaron Allston had the first of each trilogy, and then you had Christie Golden had the middle book in each trilogy, and then Troy Denning had the final book in each trilogy. And I have been reviewing every book on my channel for the last about 4 months. I started reading the series at the end of August, or maybe it was the beginning of September, and I have been reading them all the way through December, and I finished the last one in December, and I've just had an absolute blast reading this series. There have been some highs, there have been some lows, and I'll talk about those, but overall, I really enjoyed this series. I think this is catapulted up to be one of the top series for me. It's not higher than the original Thrawn trilogy or the Hand of Thrawn duology or even the New Jedi Order. I still think that New Jedi Order probably takes the number 2 or 3 spot, but I think that this series is certainly up there, and it's better than most of the other trilogies, and for me, better than the Legacy of the Force, which includes 2 of the 3 of the same author. So it's funny that I think they did a better job here. And I'll talk a little bit about why in a second. As part of this, I'm going to have to get into some spoilers on the series in order to talk about it in full. I'll talk about some things more vaguely, but just be warned, if you haven't read the series, maybe just watch through my reviews as you're reading through, because maybe this might not be the best opportunity for you to get into the series, because I might spoil some things. But I want to quickly go through what I thought of each individual book, and then I'll go through some of the high points and low points in the books. So the first book was an admirable book, had some really good moments, but some plot lines I did not care for. Omen, I feel very similar about, and Abyss I thought was a step up from those 2 books, but still wasn't stellar. I thought that Backlash, this was a pretty good book where every plotline was pretty good, and same with Allies. And then I thought Vortex, why are we still middling through? This felt like a step backwards. And then same with Conviction, I felt like it was a step backwards. Then all of a sudden, we had Ascension, which was absolutely brilliant. I mean, everything about this book, everything about Ascension was great. It's one of my favorite Star Wars books of all time now. I mean, this book was just amazing. I can't gush about it enough. And then you have the finale, Apocalypse, which was really well done. Really well done. Not as good as Ascension, but really well done. So that's my overview of the 9 books, just what I thought about them generally. When you think about the Fate of the Jedi series, I think that one thing that helps the book series is it's very tight. One thing that hurts the book series is that it becomes a little samey. The best books are the ones that don't feel samey, the ones that feel like they're expanding into something new. They're going into territory in the style, which is why I think that Ascension and Apocalypse feel the least like the others, which is why I think they're so strong. But the series as a whole feels very tight because they knew what they were doing. One of the criticisms I had of the Legacy of the Force series was it felt like Aaron Allston had one direction that he was going, and Karen Traviss had another. And Troy Denning tried to plot a middle course between the 2 of them, but it didn't really jive well. And so you feel like you have 3 different courses that the series is going on, and it doesn't feel natural. And it feels like it was more of they all got an opportunity to write in the timeline, and they were just reacting to the other person's stuff. But whenever Karen Traviss got there, did I say Karen Traviss? I may have. Anyway, whenever Karen Traviss got there, she'd be like, I'm going to go in my own direction. And it was kind of frustrating that she would do that in The Legacy of the Force. And so every time I got to one of her books, I was like, all right, let's go see what's happening with the Mandos. Like, I just felt kind of like expecting it by the last book that she wrote. This book series doesn't feel like that. Each author obviously has their strengths. I think that it's pretty obvious when you read this series that Christie Golden was the Lost Tribe of the Sith author. She's the one that spearheaded the writing of those characters, and she's the one that understood those characters the best. But it didn't feel too jarring that we were following those characters. We followed them throughout. They were a big part of the series throughout, but it felt like they got a step up in each of her books. You had her book Omen is where we introduced them overall, and then Allies was when they had to team up with the Lost Tribe, and I thought that was a great book. And then, of course, you have Ascension, which is where a lot of the stuff comes to a head. And so Christie Golden really feels like she's the Lost Tribe author. And then you have Troy Denning, who is really he's the Abeloth author. He's the one I think gets the most time with Abeloth as the character, and also I think gets her the best. You have Abyss, where he introduces Abeloth. You have Vortex, where the Jedi and the Sith kind of face off against Abeloth. And then the finale, Apocalypse, where the big finale of the series is. And so that leaves me with, what did Aaron Allston bring to the table? And I don't think that Aaron Allston particularly brought like something to the table like the other two did. He didn't have a villain or a plot line per se that really was his strength. I think that what Aaron Allston brought to the series was his humor, but also he brought a lot of connections, which Troy Denning also did. So Aaron Allston, it feels like he didn't leave a mark on the series as much of his counterparts. You had Outcast, and then the two books, Backlash had to do with the Dathomiri and had to deal with the witches of Dathomir, and so because of that, there seemed like a lot of connections to the EU. And then Conviction has a lot of connections to the Callista trilogy because of certain characters who show up here and certain locations that show up here. And so I guess you could say connections, but Christie Golden and Troy Denning also did those connections as well. So it's weird to say that it really does feel like the person who added the least and was the weakest link in this series was actually Aaron. And I know that he had a heart attack when he was writing this series, and so he had some health problems. But I'm just saying, from a creative perspective, that's just what I'm observing about the series. I still think the series is overall very well done, and each of these authors has entries that are really well done. Personally, my favorite of the authors to contribute was Christie. I think that Christie's 3 books are among... I think that she has books 1, 3, and 4. If I were to rank the series, the only book that is in the middle is, I think, Apocalypse would be book 2, but she has books 1, 3, and 4. So Christie Golden, I thought, just did a terrific job adding to this series. And she's also written other Star Wars books. She's also written Dark Disciple, which I thought was amazing, and she wrote the Battlefront Twilight Company Inferno Squad novel that I thought was also really well done. Talking about getting into a little bit about the specifics of the series now, I have some of my high points and I have some low points. The first high point, I have 6 major high points I want to talk about and 5 major low points. So I'll start with the high points. The first high point I have is the opening of the book Apocalypse. I talked about this in my review of the book, but the sequence where we're going through and seeing each of the Jedi go through and capture parts of Coruscant was a brilliant sequence, so entertaining to watch. It showed the Jedi having to be the ones that are being stealthy and the Sith being the ones that have the upper hand, and it was a complete opposite of where generally these series are. Usually it's the Jedi who are out in the open in the post-Return of the Jedi universe. The Jedi are the ones who are well known, even in the prequel trilogy, same thing, and the Sith are kind of having to sneak around. Well, this kind of reversed that a little bit, and I thought that was just some excellent sequences there. I also thought that the opening of Ascension was one of the best openings of the book. It was kind of bold to spend the first about 60 pages of the book not featuring any characters like you're not following Luke, Han, or Leia. You're not even following their children like Ben or Jaina. No. You're following the Lost Tribe as they're dealing with Abeloth on Kashiri. And we haven't been back to Kashiri in several books, and so that was a little bit jarring, but it's jarring in a good way because it was just such a good... It felt like a fantasy novel. It felt like, kind of like in Game of Thrones, when they introduced the king to Winterfell for the first time. It's kind of like that, but dark and evil, because it's Abeloth, and she's coming to Kashiri, to Kesh, I should say, not Kashiri. She's coming to Kesh for the first time. And that whole sequence where you're like, oh my goodness, who's going to kill whom? How's it going to go down? Are they really going to ally with her? You just don't know. I thought that was a brilliant sequence. My number 4 note that I want to say is that I will heavily criticize the Luke and Ben missions, and I think that the Luke and Ben missions are the weakest point in this series by far. But there were a few high points for their series, for their missions, that were actually entertaining, and those were in the books Backlash and Allies. These are the two missions, the one where they're on Dathomir, and then the one where they have to team up with the Lost Tribe on, I believe it was Klaatuin, and also when they're going back to the Maw to find Abeloth. These were the two books where it felt like they had A, the most interesting of the side plots, but B, where it felt like it actually added to the story and felt like it was natural. I can say I enjoyed their subplots in these two books. I did not enjoy their subplots in any of the other books, books 1 or 2 or 6 or 7, or 1, 2, and 3 or 6 or 7. So, and then, but I thought that their subplots here were really good. So if you're thinking, oh, I'm not enjoying the subplots of Luke and Ben in the first couple, I think that this is where you'll be like, oh, hey, maybe it is exciting. My number 3 I want to talk about is the whole sequence of the Coruscant, the Jedi versus Dala. That is something that is present throughout the whole 7-book series, but really comes to a head in Conviction. And I think that that whole stuff really works. Dala is just, and it's funny that I talk so much in previous books and did my reviews about Dala at the beginning, and then she kind of just, I stopped talking about her once I got to the last 2 books, because really it becomes about Abeloth. It's no longer about Dala being the main villain. But Dala is a formidable villain, and she is kind of frustrating throughout. She's one of those villains that you hate her not because she's evil, you hate her because she's in your way all the time. And you see that throughout the whole 7-book series, but they finally go to overthrow her in Conviction. And I think it is kind of exciting and exhilarating to see that happen. And I really enjoyed getting to see her put on the back foot, her having to decide, okay, am I going to go over with the Empire? And really, I think that there should have been some discussion in the Empire of, hey, this woman was from this other group, she was their head of state, she just left them and now she wants to be our head of state? Like, are we really going to let her do that? Are we just going to let her switch sides willy-nilly without so much as a debriefing or anything? Like, she just goes over and it's like, all right, I'm going to be head of state now, guys. You guys going to join me? And that's, I would think that would be a little bit frustrating. But it was interesting to follow her in that plot line. My number 2 is going to be moment of high points, is Ben and Vistara in Ascension. Ben and Vistara just, their dynamic is so good in this series. It has a flavor of Romeo and Juliet, particularly when you get to Apocalypse, when things start going wrong and they're on the opposite sides of the conflict. But they have such a great dynamic throughout the series, and you see them go from, not liking each other at all to starting to have to work together to, by this book, kind of falling in love. And I know they're teenagers. They're like 17 at this point in the books, but you know what I mean. And they have such a heartwarming dynamic. And when Vistara basically, the best word I could use is converts. When Vistara converts to the Jedi and she says she wants to be a Jedi, she wants to discard being a Sith, she wants to do the right thing. When you see her do that in this book, it's so heartwarming, and you're so happy for her, and you're so happy for Ben, who, after so long of having his mother out of his life, of having his father exiled, he has all these things going against him. Finally, something in his life is going right. He finally has someone, a woman who loves him. And my heartstrings were so tugged in those sequences. And so it just felt so tragic when they pull them apart in Apocalypse. It was so tragically done. It's a hard emotional 1-2 punch, these 2 books, when that happens. Finally, my number 1 high point of the series is going to be the teaming up of the Lost Tribe and the Jedi, particularly in the book Allies. This was just so interesting because the Jedi have never had team up with Sith like this before. There may have been sequences in other books where it's like, oh, we're both on like in the Clone Wars series, there's an episode where Dooku and the Jedi are having to work together to escape from Hondo Ohnaka or something. But usually the case is that the Jedi are fighting the Sith, but they have a common enemy who is much more freaky and scary than either of them is. And so this book features them having to work together to try to stop Abeloth, and they form a kind of an alliance, hence why the book's titled Allies. And that was just such a cool, it was a bold thing to do, and I liked it. And that's why that was my number one moment I'll talk about for the series, because it was a bold, creative, inventive moment for the series to do that really changed the way the game was working. Now I have to talk about the low points. I have 5 low points. And it's hard to talk about low points because I don't want to bash on the series, but I do have some low points. Number 5 for me is the decision that is made by the Jedi in these 2 books. Is at the end of Ascension, they basically decide we need to leave Coruscant and we need to get away from the people. And then they do. And that sets up the Lost Tribe being able to infiltrate Coruscant and get in and all that stuff. And then the Jedi have to come back in Apocalypse, which they do, and fight the Sith. And then as soon as it's over, it's, all right, time to go. We're leaving again. And it just feels like they come to the same conclusion and the same decision for the same reasons twice. And it should not have happened. I know why it happened, because they needed to get them off of Coruscant so that they could get them back on. Like, that made sense. Getting them off of Coruscant was the right decision. And making them leave Coruscant was the right decision. But because it's the same reasoning and the same stuff both times, it feels bland and it feels like a rehash and it feels like the authors weren't on the same page. Here's how I would have changed that. I would have said that the Jedi believe that they have located Abeloth and her forces, and they are all going to target her. They're not abandoning the Jedi Temple. They're not saying we're never coming back to Coruscant. What they're saying is we're sending a strike team of almost all of our Jedi to go and stop this threat. And so you see the strike team leaving, and that's when the Sith infiltrate. Instead, it's we're abandoning the temple. Yeah, we'll leave the Barabels, but we're abandoning the temple, and we're not gonna come back. And then they have to come back because the Sith return. And I just feel like that could have been handled better. My number 4 is the Tahiri trial. The Tahiri trial was, I believe it's just in the books. I'm pretty sure it kind of starts off in Backlash, and I know it continues in Allies and Vortex and Conviction. But I was so frustrated that the trial went on for so long. This trial should have gone maybe 2 books. Maybe. I think the trial looked like it was ready to be done at the end of Vortex. It really should have been done. It really should have just been 1 or 2 books at most. But making the trial go on for 4 books was infuriating, and it was frustrating that they could not get things moving along. And it felt like they were trying to fill 9 books. It was not that they had 9 books of stories that they wanted to tell. It was that they had a 9-book contract and therefore had to spread out the story among those 9 books. They could have cut 300 pages of this series down from the Tahiri storyline to make it more lean and make it, because we rehash so much, not because they're just retelling the same story, but basically they're going over the same type of evidence, and they're basically just reintroducing evidence that's not going to change the way the story goes. And that was a very, very frustrating part of this series. I also want to point out the humor in one of the books. The humor that Aaron Allston has is always different from the other authors. He's always known for his humor. And his humor generally works in his Star Wars books, especially in something like, say, the New Jedi Order, where each author was given 1 or 2 books, and they're not part of trilogies necessarily. They're usually just, have a book here, book here, book here, and you can get away with just doing humor in there. But when you're writing the first book of each trilogy in this series, and then you're the one with the ridiculous humor, it feels jarring in a bad way. I've talked about jarring in a good way in other parts here. It felt jarring in a bad way. And in Conviction, when we're at our darkest point of fighting Dala, the Jedi are overthrowing the Senate. The Jedi are doing all these things to stop Dala, and they're constantly cracking jokes and being silly, and there's fart jokes and there's other things in there. And I was just like, Aaron, this is not the time for it. Like, there's other times in the series, humor would work perfectly. This is not the book that needed to be the funny book. But there's so many sequences where he writes humor. And I'll be honest, they're funny. It's a funny sequence, but it's just so frustrating that he kept cutting the tension with the humor. And I like when things like the MCU do that, but that's because it's across the board in the MCU and it feels natural. Here it feels just like, oh well, this is just Aaron just doing that because it's his series. So that was a little bit frustrating of a low point. My number 2 is, this is more for the beginning of the series, less for the end of the series, but seeing this Jedi go crazy in the first about, I think, 4 or 5 books over and over and over again was repetitive and boring. I believe, I might be wrong in my memory, but I believe it happens once or twice in each of the first 5 books. I don't believe it happens in books 7 through 9, but you see the Jedi snap because Abeloth is affecting their mind. You see them snap because something is changed in them because of the Maw and all that stuff. But it just keeps happening over and over, and we just see the same things happen. And again, this feels like the authors were trying to fill time as opposed to fill the series. They didn't have 9 books worth of series, they had 9 books worth of contracts to fill. And so that's why they kept rehashing those things. Then you have my number 1 biggest problem, and I alluded to this earlier, but it's still my biggest problem, is the Luke and Ben side plots in this series are the absolute drag down for the series for me. And maybe other people enjoy them, and if you do, that's great. But for me, the Luke and Ben side plots in books 1 through 7 just dragged the story down, even at their highest in Allies and Backlash, books 4 and 5. Even when they were at the best, they still weren't as good as the rest of the plot lines. And they felt like it was, all right, we need to fill this book. What are we going to do? We're going to give Luke and Ben something to explore and explore this element of the Force. And that's kind of cool if your thing is that. But it felt like it was taking away from the overall story. I do believe they could have made this a 5-book series. I really do. I think that they could have made, given one author books 1 and 5, but give another author books 2 and 4, and then a third author book 3, and they make that the longest book or something. This did not need to be 9 books. I think that books 8 and 9, Ascension and Apocalypse, are pretty much good as they are. I mean, of course, I would make changes, and I talk about those changes, but for the most part, I would keep them exactly the way they are. But you could have easily cut down like a third or more of books 1 through 7 and rearranged the timeline a little bit, rearranged the plots, meshed things together, cut things out, cauterized them, and it would have been shorter, it would have been leaner, and it would have been a better story. And I understand that they wanted to make it kind of match the Legacy of the Force, which was a 9-book series with 3 authors in the same way, but it didn't need to be that way. They absolutely could have done this and cut it down a lot. And so that's the number 1 low point that I have for the series that they absolutely should have changed. But that is my overall series discussion for The Fate of the Jedi. There's so many other things I could talk about. I didn't even really talk about the Barabel storyline at all. I didn't talk about Alana Solo or the threats on her life or the Jag and Jaina stuff. There's so much else I could have talked about. But those are my big highs and lows. Those were my general thoughts, what I thought about the authors contributing, what I thought about the general books, all that stuff. So if you have read the Fate of the Jedi series, please let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below, and let me know who are your favorite and least favorite characters, and all that kind of stuff. So until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.